Hello everyone, my name is Onaiza, and if someone asks me about myself, my instinct is always to say Kashmiri first. I am Kashmiri. I am a Kashmiri writer, I am a Kashmiri anthropologist. And as someone who draws her core identity from her ethnicity, it is a pity that growing up I could never speak the language. Only much later did I come to it, through a lot of luck and a little bit of effort, and a rage inside me as a young, idealistic adult coming of age, witnessing assaults on her people and her culture. So when I started to think about what decolonizing translation could look like for this language, for my language, for Kashmiri or Kashur as we call it, a range of thoughts sparked in my head. I traveled back in time to recall instances growing up, surrounded by women and men speaking this rich tongue. And I, receptively bilingual, as a consequence, took on this tongue in other languages. I took on its convoluted manner of illustration, its visual idiom, its proverbs. They always seeped into my English and my Urdu. Although recently I've noticed that I speak differently now, I feel it's almost impersonal, harsh really, to use only words and archaic to use full sentences. Especially while texting. Emojis serve as expressions for me. And as a consequence, since much of my communication is mediated through the WhatsApps of the world, many expressions have slowly fallen out of my vocabulary. My sentences have become shorter, crisper, more hollow, yet more efficient. If I were to follow Sapir-Whorf's hypothesis that language alters one's cognition and worldview, I'd assume that with my shrinking vocabulary, my world shrinks around me. Rapid texting, automated responses, handy urban dictionary-esque phrases have encouraged cliches and limited expression for the whole world, really. Standard formulations, global in nature and laconic in character, are replacing careful constructions. And we, as speakers, we sacrifice the beauty of a language at the altar of efficient communication. So as you can see, my process really began with the realization that my mother tongue, a language native to a small, contested valley in the Indian subcontinent with a mere 7 million speakers, competes with global speak. A few years ago, I was writing a book retelling Kashmiri folklore, and while researching, I found folk belief and memory alive in the language. It wasn't something I'd paid attention to earlier, so I noted down every instance to build almost a dictionary of memory, a memory of imponderabilia that seep into our lives and in our conversations. Examining it, I saw that what one is taught to classify as folklore here went beyond the stories I was searching for. Here, I found a way of life alive in speech, the culture of people enshrined in words that make up a language. Some would call it superstition and others a belief system. Yet for us, it is how we live, or rather how we lived or used to live. It was an ethical system now largely glimpsed through phrases that remain in our speech, remnants of when scientific temper and rationality had stripped us of the surrender to that which we don't know, and a consciousness through which those before us tried to make sense of the world. I'll give you an example, a real life example. We in Kashmiri say, Osa ehsan hai, when asking after someone's health. Was there mercy, it translates to. As though there's someone being merciful and as though there's someone listening to what we're saying. Today, we're much more likely to use words off the shelf of global speak. Sorry osa theek, we'll say today. Was all okay? It does what it was intended to, after all. It communicates an inquiry of well-being. But you might notice what is lost. There is a preserve of delicacy in the way we speak Kashmiri. There's a consciousness of others that's alive in the language. The utterance of words, for instance, that might invoke harm is discouraged. Even in a reprimand, we qualify it being intended for our ill-wishers, those who are our enemies. We'll say dushmanan. How are you doing? We hear your enemies are unwell. This sensitivity is not just an embellished figure of speech. It's a signal of a larger set of ethics and consciousness. And increasingly, when I hear people substitute English and Urdu for the vernacular, it's a bit jarring. I find them dismiss superstition and watch idioms slip away in a quest for rationality. Other words from other places now find a place in our speech. Asli asik na abadana. Truly their grain and water wasn't destined, is how we would say it. But now, timgai na adjust yete. They couldn't adjust here. Translators often invoke the cliché of being traitors to tongues when talking of translating texts. Yet as speakers, we don't pay attention to the betrayals of translation that we bring into our everyday speech. We don't notice the shame associated with speaking a tongue in the presence of power, the disdain of superstition, the perceived superiority of rationality, and the self-censoring that ensues, cleansing our sentences of imagery of the other world. Our everyday tongue is becoming globalized, bereft of the idiom that makes it aesthetically beautiful. And I'd like to build on what I'd said earlier. It isn't just global speak our language competes with, but global rational speak. You can see I'm very sentimental about this. Yet, this problem is nothing exclusive to Kashmir and the Kashmiri language, but for us, there is reason to feel strongly. There are layers of power and polarization that operate at all times. I won't dwell on this today, and there's much more to be read on this. But what I will say is that for a people who for 7 centuries have had various non-Kashmiri regimes rule them, the language has become a marker of our ethnicity. What the non-indigenous rule has also meant is that the language has been pushed into the realm of the oral. It thrived there, but only until the 1990s, a turbulent time that changed the social fabric of Kashmir. This was when a generation of young, urban Kashmiris took on the language and culture of the Indian subcontinent much more than ever before. Thinking in Hindustani, translating to Kashmiri, young children grew up betraying their tongues while their parents struggled to live. As families grappled with their worlds rapidly transforming around them, they forgot to hand down rituals and idioms. When the dust settled, a generation of Kashmiri children couldn't answer back in the language of their ancestors. They hid trauma in this one-sided communication, hearing in Kashmiri and answering back in a lilted Hindustani, much like myself. For Kashmir, therefore, it isn't only global rational speak that we compete with. For us, it is also the presence of power, or rather powers, that often control what we say and how. Threatened with erasure, both cultural and linguistic, it is only natural to think of preservation and revival as a Kashmiri. And this is where literature comes in, and of course translation. The act of translating to and from the language, reading more in it, are all acts of an activist in a scenario like this. Simple articulations in our own tongue, fearless, unafraid interpretations. Isn't this reclamation of vocabulary and an act of resistance in itself? Isn't this where we should turn to revive language then, to relearn idiom, to literature that is? But then what of a language with an absence of a repertoire of literature and ethical codes in writing? A mere 12 or 13 novels are known to have been written in Kashmiri. There are short stories, but pitifully few. So through this process of trying to understand what decolonizing translation means for Kashmiri, this is where I came to. This exasperated soliloquy in my head was going on as I wrote my essay, and suddenly I realized that I'd missed something very important. I'd missed the inherent orality in our language. For a people at faced with a new calamity every generation, wise aphorisms have been passed down for generations as inherited wisdom, as oral literature. The orality of our language has also meant that it's lent itself beautifully to poetry, again passed down generations. Songs, stories, dramas, proverbs, these are where the richness of Kashmiri lies. In these are also packed the ethical and moral codes, a need for resilience, environmental consciousness, affirmations of faith. And this really made me think that it is us to blame, is it not? For do we ourselves accord these genres oral genres the respect we would traditional literature? Why did I go looking for novels in the first place? A genre so alien, there isn't even a word for it in the language. What then can we do to keep these alive? In other words, what could processes of translation and preservation beyond tokenism mean? It is paradoxical, really, the answer I came up with to this question. And it is that the very global digital media that throttles the language of our home, that makes it compete with global languages, is also where the active processes to keep it alive thrive. Groups of Kashmiris get together on Twitter, on WhatsApp, Clubhouse to revive the language one word at a time. They do it through quizzes, through conversation, through memes, audio, visual, satire, poetry, humor. And all of this helps manifest a sleeping register of Kashmiri, awakening the so-called untranslatable words lying asleep in corners of our subconscious. Speaking a tongue, invoking poetry, saying the words out loud, gives the language a new lease of life, really. And it is online, it is in the digital space, within these spaces of superficial satire, that language and cultural production are also, at last, thriving. It is also here that they're seemingly and overtly free of traditional power dynamics. Space is democratized, there's a ready audience available, and censorship doesn't restrict the creator. Even the economics of it might make sense, and the language lives in the form it knows best, oral. It transforms, but it is alive. This beckons the thought that should we then not engage in processes of decolonizing translation through modes and media better suited to the language? If storytelling is alive in the margins beyond the metropole, is it our shortcoming that we find the spoken word inadequate? Should we not instead adapt to formats we're trained to think of as non-literary? In other words, why impose structures of publishing to a language in whose character it doesn't exist? Verse, sung, not written, dramatized folklore, performed, not read. If a language is oral in its character, should we not translate it so? And can we, in this process of adapting to orality, find ways to decolonize the language by ridding ourselves of the inherent superiority of written literature? Can we give precedence to the oral and use digital technologies to give it a new lease of life? One that isn't restricted by censorship, finds an audience, but also addresses dynamics of power and polarization. This is just about as far as I got with this. Maybe someday I will take this forth with answers and with action. But until then, I leave you with these questions to engage with, and I'd love to pick up conversations around it. Please do write in if you'd wish to chat. And thank you so much for your attention.